Welcome to all of those viewing this webcast here on Zoom and on the IABC Houston Facebook page. I want to thank you all for taking the time out of your busy schedule today as we navigate the coronavirus pandemic and join our panel of experts as we discuss crisis management and COVID-19. For those of you that don't know, my name is Austin Staton, president of IABC Houston, which was recently recognized last month as the IABC International Chapter of the Year. We know this is a very difficult time for many within our communications family with unknowns surrounding the virus, employment. It's been a challenge. And during this time, our goal is to provide value and resources to our chapter by utilizing webinars. And we won't charge a dime while doing this. Our only ask is that you support one another. And if you're looking for work or have opportunities, please reach out to us via email at iabchouston@gmail.com, and we'll try to connect you with the right people. As a reminder, we want this webinar to be as interactive as possible, so please submit any questions you have in the chat box, and we'll get to as many as we can throughout this discussion. And before we get started, I would like to also recognize our board of directors for rallying together to put on this event in such short notice. Haley, Andrew, Ruth, Deanna, Amanda, Lauren, Shay, Helen, Paul, Denise, and Susan. Thank you for all that you have done to support our chapter this year. Now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce our panelists. First, we have Judge Emmett. He is a former county judge of Harris County, Texas from 1979 to 1987. He served as a Republican member of the Texas House of Representatives. After a 20-year hiatus from politics, he was elected as county judge to head the 5-member Harris County Commissioners Court based in Houston. And he also led our region following the aftermath of Hurricane Harvey, for which he was recognized as the 2018 IABC Houston Executive Communicator of the Year. Judge Emmett is now a professor at Rice University, a senior fellow at Rice's Kinder Institute for Urban Research, and a distinguished senior fellow at Northeastern University's Global Resilience Institute. And he also maintains his transportation logistics consultant practice here in Houston, Texas. Judge Emmett, your bio is quite extensive, and I'm sure I left several things out, but I want to thank you for joining today.
Oh, good afternoon. Glad to do it. I'm one of the few people who probably took the opportunity to put on a suit again.
I am not wearing a suit. I'm going with a vest today. It's a little more comfortable. But next we have Pierpont's Communications COO, Clint Woods. Clint leverages more than 20 years of industry experience to ensure future growth for Pierpont Communications. Clint is responsible for client and employee development, setting firm-wide strategy and overseeing many functions across the agency, such as strategic partnerships, P&L growth, M&A activities, and more. In addition to leading Pierpont's energy practice, Clint has worked with clients across a broad spectrum of industries, including automotive, retail, enterprise, hardware and software, professional services, so on and so forth. Clint, thank you so much for joining.
Glad to be here. Thanks for having me on.
All right, perfect. And next, we have Dr. Chris Yandle, who I had the pleasure of working with inside the Baylor Athletic Department when I was a student at the university. Chris is a native of South Louisiana and a former college athletics administrator and an award-winning public relations professional at both the K-12 and college level. After spending more than a decade with 5 different NCAA Division I athletics programs, he transitioned to K-12 communications in his home state back in 2016. Considered among the leading communications professionals in college athletics, Chris served as the assistant athletic director for communications at the University of Miami and Georgia Tech. He was COSIDA's recipient of the 2014 Rising Star Award. He is the author of Lucky Enough, a year of Dad's daily notes for encouragement and life lessons to his daughter. And he continues to share his daily notes on social media in an effort to help parents make non-digital connections in the digital world. Chris, thank you so much for joining.
Austin, thanks for having me, and glad we could have it during halftime of my son's living room basketball game.
Well, that's working from home. Things are a little bit different. And as many of you know, this is our first webinar for IABC Houston, but we are hoping to continue to do this as long as the COVID-19 pandemic ensues. But I want to start off with Judge Emmett. And Judge, you were instrumental in Hurricane Harvey response. And, while Houston is no stranger to floods, pandemics are a little bit different. We had swine flu back in 2009, but I don't know that we've had anything such as COVID-19. In your time as leading Harris County and networking with different regions here within the greater Houston area, what type of crisis planning did you undertake for pandemic response?
Well, actually, that's a good question. People talk about it a lot. The Harris County Office of Emergency Management and SETRAC, the Southeast Texas Regional Advisory Council, which is the first responders and healthcare, they basically tabletopped and planned for pandemics for years and years and years. What's been interesting about this, and let me start at the beginning and say, you know, I'm not here to criticize or to pass judgment on what elected officials now are doing. That serves no purpose. We got to get through this. But it has been interesting to me that you haven't seen a lot of the Office of Emergency Management. It's been run by public health for the most part. You haven't seen a lot from SETRAC, which is the coordinating group. So I think in a way, they got off to a bad start in the sense of nobody knew exactly what to do. And I won't take too long to answer the question, but as I've told my students at Rice, if you go back in history, there have been certain seminal moments, you know, Civil War, for example. But in terms of hurricanes and those, Hurricane Andrew was that moment when suddenly the government was looked to as somehow being responsible for the response to a hurricane. Prior to that, they were natural disasters. They happened. Everybody, you know, they might wring their hands, but that was it. This seems to be that seminal moment for healthcare, to where suddenly around the world, governments are looked to head off a crisis. People like to compare to H1N1 when 12,000 people died in 1 year in 2009. There wasn't this kind of outcry, but it's probably the right thing to do. And so the communication is something new and different. You're right. Even though we practiced it, when it comes right down to how does the government exert influence and get people to do things, that is a whole new approach. And I've got to say, I'm not completely unhappy that I'm not there right now and having to deal with it.
Yeah, it's definitely a very challenging time. And kind of expanding on that question a little bit more, the greater Houston area has many different counties. Of course, we've got Montgomery County, which I grew up in. We have Fort Bend County, which a lot of probably the people watching this right now live in. But I've seen that different counties are taking different approaches to how they're communicating their messaging to the greater public. When you were in office, was there cooperation amongst the greater region? And if so, are you a little bit concerned that there are mixed messages at this point?
Well, I am concerned, but again, that gets back to what I said about public health taking the lead in the beginning. If you remember, the first case in our region was Fort Bend County. And we didn't know a whole lot about it, didn't know why. The second case was the researcher at Rice, where Rice University suddenly went out and said, oh, we have put this person under quarantine and 14 people she was in contact with. And I started asking the question then, shouldn't the public know who else that researcher has been in contact with? And in a sort of lighthearted approach, when you come back from an international trip like that person had, what are the things you want to do first? You want to go to the grocery store? You want to go eat Mexican food? Where did that occur? Well, it also turns out she'd taken communion at St. Cecilia's Catholic Church on Ash Wednesday. None of that messaging got out there early. So maybe it wouldn't have done any good, but I think if we could have identified early on all the counties working together and say, we know that this person went here, here, and here, maybe there could have been a little bit more containment. But the general coordination, I'll give you the classic example. The mayor of Houston and the Harris County judge are front and center. But there are 33 other cities in Harris County. Those people need to be involved. All the surrounding county judges need to be involved. I think early on, there needed to be a group of everybody, not all talking, but everybody saying, okay, we're in the same room. We're going to work this out.
Yeah, I tend to agree with you. I think that the only way that we can get through this together is by cooperating and not worrying about county lines. I think that we have to work together to really make sure that we have a clear and consistent message while fighting this pandemic. It's something that's uncharted waters for us right now, and there's a lot of unknowns, and I think it's a little bit frightening. I'm going to go on to Clint right now. Clint, at Pierpont, you've you work with a variety of different clients with internal, external communications. And I know that specifically you also work with media training and crisis response. What has been your take so far on how corporations have, kind of communicated messages to their key stakeholders, their employees? And if there's one piece of advice maybe that you would give to them moving forward, what would it be?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Austin. And also, I'd like to acknowledge Judge Emmett for all his years of leadership. I think your comments are spot on, Judge Emmett, and I'm honored to be here on the panel with you. Our clients tend to skew towards larger corporations in general. And what we're seeing right now is that many crisis plans were effectively rendered obsolete in the last 60 days, let's say. And there's really a flight to values, was what I'm calling it. Companies are looking to their core values as their true north for how they're going to behave, because you can't communicate your way out of a problem that you behave yourself into. So we're seeing clients really fall back on those aspects more than a communications discipline. It's more of a reliance on their integrity, how they treat employees, the respect that they have. From a pure play communication standpoint, we're advising, and we're seeing that customers are adhering to, how do we communicate with our internal audiences first? Our most precious assets, the employees, and then concentric circles from there out. Customers, influencers, investors, and other stakeholders that they may intersect. So I think right now we're in the middle of this situation, and customers, the winners and losers have not been determined, but we're seeing that customers are more or less trying to react and adapt in real time. And so that leadership from our public health officials and from our elected officials that we look to is absolutely critical at this juncture.
I agree with you 100%. And Chris, I do want to bring it over to you real quick. You and I have known each other since probably 2007, 2008. It's a little bit different time now, because when I was working with you, we were preparing for the NCAA basketball tournament. And right now, March Madness is not happening. Right. So I think a lot of people are getting used to the idea of working from home now, practicing social distancing. And if you're not practicing social distancing right now, I really, really ask that you do so. I think it's critical for us to get through this pandemic. But I think with all of that, we have to focus on mental health. And mental health and maintaining, that positive attitude can be very difficult at times like this. I know that you've been a strong advocate for mental health. What kind of tips and approach have you taken in particular as working in education right now? And what kind of advice have you shared with people in your community at this time?
That's a good question. I think it's almost like trying to be a parent and helping with our kids' mental health. I'm going into my public relations skill set. I feel like I'm in crisis mode at home and trying to communicate that with my kids. But it's a scary time for all of us. None of us really know what's going on. And I think now so more than ever, we should communicate that. We should ask people how they're doing and checking in on friends. I tell people to do that. I need to follow my own advice because unfortunately working in education PR sometimes right now, I don't have the luxury of kind of stepping back and taking a breather, especially in this crucial element of time. But I think kids want routine and structure. This is our new normal, and I hate the word normal because normal doesn't exist. And I think it's important just to keep them calm. And, we're all going to break eventually. And I think trying to have some sort of semblance of normalcy and calm and just keeping them busy, keeping them structured, because my 11-year-old daughter, she's doing a really good job social isolating. She can be like a PSA. She hasn't come out in a week and a half. But I think it's important. Working from home is tough. Austin, you remember working in college athletics. We had to work from home all the time, but that was at midnight, 1 o'clock in the morning, not 8 to 5, normal business hours, while also educating our kids, entertaining our kids, going to the grocery store 7 times a week. So I think at the end of the day, we all need to know that we're all trying to do the best we can none of us have that magic bullet to try to get through it. And, you know, if anything, it's time to get connected with our emotions again, and really showing our kids it's okay to feel this way.
I agree. Clint, Judge Emmett, I'm going to kind of ask that question to you, because Judge Emmett, right now you're teaching online classes at Rice, and Clint, I know you've got young kids of your own. How are you guys navigating this personally within your homes, your current jobs?
Well, in my case, we have abandoned Harris County. We're up at our cabin in Liberty County with one of my daughters and her whole family. And so I'm teaching from here. And I will say that being 70 years old, when I was first told that there were going to be no more classes at Rice, we had to go online. I am the least technologically savvy person you might ever know. So my first reaction was to say, I quit, just throw up my hands and say, I'm done. But instead, it's a great opportunity. And so I'm now learning things that I never wanted to learn, never thought I would learn, but it's what's forced on me. So rather than sit around and gripe about it, I've kind of thrown myself into it, and I and the students are working through it. And I may be learning as much as I'm teaching at this point, but I know this sounds a little Pollyanna-ish, but I think if everybody just says, okay, this is the circumstance, we can't do anything about it, let's make the best of it. So I've never wanted to learn that much about computers and how they operate and all this technology, but that's what I've got to do. So, hey, that's what I'm doing.
And I think from my perspective, Austin, I have a 2-year-old and a 5-year-old at home. So this has been doubly challenging because my wife also works, and 2 working parents at home has been an adventure, but we've enjoyed spending time with the kids in between Zoom calls, Microsoft Team calls, conference calls, et cetera. But I think, as a professional service organization, we've been able to pivot almost on an uninterrupted basis, to help our clients during this time. It's been, eye-opening to see how dutiful our employees have been, how open our clients have been, and understanding they've been to this situation, because we're all in this together, and everybody's trying to figure it out. So from the standpoint of how do we add value, even though we can't be in physical proximity to each other and among our clients as, consultative people, it's really made us stronger as an organization. But it's also, revealed some of the things that we have to work on in terms of knowledge sharing and making sure that our people are continuously connected to the organization. Because, we have folks from New York, New Jersey, all over the state of Texas. So, we have to monitor what's happening in different jurisdictions, making sure that we're following the guidance of the people that are leading those counties and cities and municipalities. So it's been eye-opening from the standpoint of how do we evaluate risks in our organization while keeping our eye on the ball for the customers. Really proud of the way that our team has stepped up and responded in that regard.
Austin, let me add a couple of things too, because I've talked to people, some restaurant owners, for example, have taken the attitude of, yes, they're trying to do as much takeout as they can, but now's the time to refurbish the interiors of their restaurants and make improvements that they couldn't do as long as customers were there every day. And then in other cases, I've heard where companies have gotten their core staff together like we're doing here and just turning it into a planning conference exercise. We can't do our normal work. Let's figure out how can we use this to come out of on the other end better than we are now. So I think the fact that it's being forced on people in a way is beneficial, because they're going, well, we don't have a choice. We're going to just go ahead and see how we can make the best of it.
And, kind of seeing how we can make the best of it. Really quickly, we are going to get to the questions. I do see a lot of them coming in right now, but how we can make the best of it. I have a friend who is a musician, and a lot of his gigs were canceled as a result of this for about 2 months. And so he was kind of uncertain on how he was going to, I guess, pay his bills. And he decided to leverage Facebook Live and stream from his living room. He was taking requests. People were, essentially having this large community gathering around, listening to music. I think he played for 4 hours. And if you go and look at his Venmo transactions, I mean, it's just insane how many people were tipping and requesting songs. So I think it's using new types of technology like that, and just trying to be creative and thinking differently. I think that's really helpful during this time. Let's go to some questions that we have right now in our chat box. We've got one from Amanda, and she says, what should we be looking to agencies for support or communications wise on a federal level versus a local or community level? So we'll leave that for anyone that wants to answer that.
I'm not sure I exactly understand the question.
If I'm going to take a stab at it, I think in terms of our communications with, basically, how should we be communicating with the federal government versus local players? Is there a certain thing that we should be doing in that regard?
Yeah, I think that depends completely on the nature of your business. But at this point, everything is local. Let's see if I get the slogan right. That was one of the big issues, since we're talking about communications here. Judge Hidalgo didn't want to use shelter in place, and I agree with her on that, by the way. So they came up with stay home, work safe. And if you look, the other counties around are doing different kinds of things because they wanted to make people understand this is different. And I do agree with that. But right now, about the only government people should be focused on is local. Because that's the one that's got control over your daily life and what you're doing in your business. Big companies that can worry about what's in the $2 trillion relief package is different. But in terms of most local businesses, just stay in touch with and I will say, for the most part, it is the county judge. It's not the mayors. The county judge is the person responsible in each county.
I think a lot of people are kind of unfamiliar with how the county judge system works, but we have another question. This comes from Nancy. She says, in our workplace, there is a portion of the workforce who don't believe we are doing enough to keep all safe, while others are happy with the precautions, measures, and so forth. Ours is a mental health hospital. Our message has been that we are all caregivers in our organization. We share those values of contributing to the health and experience of our patients. Question, is there another suggestion for reinforcing engagement and doing the right thing for those who need our help while keeping all as safe as possible? So we'll get this to Clint, Chris. Do one of you want to take it?
I think that's for Chris.
I appreciate that. Well, I can tell you from personal experience, my therapist and their group, they're going to complete telehealth. And here in Louisiana, Oshner and some other businesses, they're doing everything remotely via your phone. And that's the way to stay connected. So like my therapist and her group, you can text, you can call, FaceTime, do whatever. That way you're keeping your distance from each other. You're safe, you're healthy. You're not putting anyone else at danger. A year ago, we were complaining about everybody spending too much time on their phones. Now is the perfect reason to use that screen to make those connections without putting yourself at risk. And I think for Nancy, if their business were to offer that, I think that's a service that a lot of people would take up, because a lot of people can't leave. Here in Louisiana, there's certain places, especially New Orleans, there's parts you can't leave. So stay home, stay healthy, and you can connect through your screen. And I think that's one way to do that. That reinforces the engagement. It shows you're doing the right thing, but it keeps everybody healthy all at the same time.
Clint, we've got a question for you, and it says companies are caught in a tough spot between taking care of their employees in this immediate crisis and taking care of their business / bottom line in the long term. This person said they see some companies paying their employees or expanding benefits even while their business is closed. That's amazing, but could be difficult to recover from financially if this continues for months. What are your thoughts from a PR viewpoint on coaching companies through walking the line and communicating their decisions?
Sure. And, that's a loaded question because we don't really know how this is going to play out, how long this is going to take to resolve itself. And we're obviously seeing a lot of the workforce for major companies being furloughed. and those decisions are being put off. But for now, I think that companies are stuck in a tough position, especially the public companies and the multinationals, as to how they're going to handle operations in Europe and North America as it relates to their employee base. Some are unionized, some are not, for instance. So I think that they're focused rightly on internal audiences in communicating directly with clarity and decisiveness and being honest with them about their work situation. That's how we're advising customers right now. You can't have town hall meetings, and so some of that is less personal than you would otherwise like it to be. But companies are just finding a way to get through this situation with the channels and tools and messages that they have. But as long as they begin with the understanding that these are human beings, we have to be empathetic to the situation. But we also have to be able to have a business that sustains itself when this is over. That's the predicament that the clients that we are consulting with find themselves in. And then there's the twofold challenge of there's never been more of a yearning for information, for authoritative source, credible insights, whether it's from the media, from our elected officials. So people are at home on their devices looking for leadership. And that's from their companies and also from their influencers in their communities and their direct leadership of their boss. So how do you align those interests given the tools that you have in your organization? And as I said before, acting on your core values. There should be an economy of words in this situation and a bias to action for companies, reaching out, connecting and touching virtually, your workforce and making sure that they feel valued and connected to who you are. And if you have to make tough decisions, then communicate that with empathy, but also zoom out and show them the long view about what we can do at the end of this journey and what it's going to mean for everybody that's involved. And for some, that's going to mean a transition. And that's really the tough spot that a number of these larger businesses find themselves in because they can't sustain the cost structure. So that's where we're in the middle of this fight to help them sustain their enterprise. And that's going to be an ongoing issue for some time.
Clint and Chris, we've got a question from Chris Wolf, and he says, what are some of the don'ts that you see currently in employee comms, like internal communications? Chris, I know that you're working in the school space. What have been some strategies that you guys have stayed away from, or what have you seen work that doesn't work? And Clint, if you could follow up with that, that would be great.
I think it's important that your employees know first. Taken from my athletics time, I think every company struggles from this, and I'm sure Clint can attest. You never want your employees to find out news on Twitter or the 6 o'clock news. They should be the first group to know what's going on, whatever the plan is. So whether your business is closing, whether everyone's working from home, they shouldn't be reading that in the press release. They should be hearing about it from an email internally or from their direct supervisor. But I think, if anything, this is showing how our communications and businesses either work really well or have been really bad from the beginning, because you want to get that information out so quickly and you want to disseminate it to the masses so quickly. But then you're like, oh, I forgot about the people that kind of make this stuff happen. So you can't forget about your employees. A lot of people won't agree with this, but I think overly communicating in this situation doesn't hurt, but you have to overly communicate the information you know. Don't just overly communicate things that, well, this might happen, or it's hearsay, or it's rumor. I think it's important that when you overly communicate, it has to be facts, because facts they're going to outweigh all the fiction you may see on the news or the clickbait you see in your emails or all the push notifications. I've had to stop all the push notifications on my phone because my head's spinning. I don't know what's left, right, up, down, whatever. But I think it's really important. Ultimately, you have to over communicate with those people internally.
Yeah, I agree with that, Chris. And I think that the way that I summarize it when I do media training or when I visit with our teams and what they're hearing from customers is It's a struggle between velocity and veracity. So how do you balance the need of stakeholders that you have, in this case, your workforce, and understanding their individual situation, but understanding that you cannot communicate things that aren't backed by evidence and facts and actions that you're prepared to take. And I think that what we want to see out of our companies that we all work for is clarity and decisiveness from the leadership in action. You know, and this day and age, what people want to know is, do I have a job? And I think that that's the question that you have to answer first for the internal communications piece. And if you don't know, then you have to give them the breadcrumb trail to explain what the process is going to be and what the timeline is to the best of your knowledge. Chris, your point is so well taken on speculation. It's a core tenet of any communications exercise in crisis or media training, that you just don't speculate. And in this case, it can be fatal for an employee morale from that standpoint. So you just cannot afford to, you don't want to have to, you can't take back something that you never said. So from this standpoint, the economy of words and being efficient in your communications is probably just as important as the speed with which you communicate it.
Judge Emmett, I'm going to kind of pivot off of that and ask a question to you. And really quickly, we do see all the questions coming in. If we haven't gotten to your question, we are going to get to them soon. I see some in the chat box and in the Q&A box. But Judge Emmett, kind of bouncing off of what Clint said, I think that in times of unknown, in times of uncertainty, there's a lot of fear. I knew that was the case with Hurricane Harvey. My parents, who I think are on the webinar right now watching, their home flooded, and there was a lot of uncertainty for them on, when it would rebuild, would they get, would insurance cover it, and so on and so forth. When you're communicating to a county or a large audience in this time, how do you get your message to come across and kind of alleviate some of that fear and just to have a calming presence at times?
A couple of ways, but first and foremost, say what you know. Don't talk about what you don't know. I mean, you have to say, this is what we know. These are the decisions that have to be made. You could see, and I'm not trying to be psychoanalyst here, but you could see between the mayor and the county judge and others, they were kind of doing this dance, trying to figure out, okay, are we going to do shelter in place? Are we going to have a lockdown? Both of them said no. And then one of the most horrible things, Clint, I think you'll appreciate this, one of the most horrible things I've seen in public life, the Dallas County judge, in his press conference announcing a shelter in place for Dallas County, announced that Harris County was going to follow. And it put Judge Hidalgo in this just awful situation to where she had to come out and say something before she was ready to say anything. And so that was a bad situation. But the key is to focus on what you know. And that's why, to use the hurricane example, Hurricane Ike was sort of my first big hurricane. And we all know the meteorologist, Jeff Lindner. We got to know him pretty well. And early on in that, he briefed somebody who briefed me, and then I went out and talked. And then I realized, why am I doing this? Why don't we have Jeff out here telling people? Because he's really the expert. So I think the other thing is we have to rely on other people to state the facts. And as long as we stick to facts, the public's smart. I mean, they will do what needs to be done. The problem I see going forward now is there doesn't seem to be an end game. Everybody says, well, this is till April the 3rd, and this is till April the 6th. And, when do we get out of it? What's the metric that we're going to use to say, okay, it's time. We're never going to get back to normal, but it's time to go back into daily life. That's the one piece that's still really missing to me.
I saw this question come in from Jennifer, and she asked us in the Q&A, and I saw Clint and Chris, I think, answer this, but how are you communicating with employees who are non-traditional and not in front of computers? I know in Houston, we've got, refining chemical plants. How are you getting that message across to them, or maybe even people that are working from home, like critical messages? Are you using, do you use email? Do you rely on phones? What is the best approach here?
Yeah, I'll jump in on that. I'm not a very good listener and typer. Multitasking, not my strength here. So I appreciate that question. I'll give an example. In one of our clients is Group One Automotive, and they're in the news today. They took some tough actions with their workforce that they were forced to take. And what I know about that organization is that they have a very strong level of leadership at the market level and from a regional standpoint. And they were able to use that management infrastructure as a communications option or avenue. So you have to rely on the strengths of your organization. You can't use communications to solve your operational issues or your risk issues. It's a tool that's used as a means to the end. What you have in place are great, middle managers, people that are in the field, that have the text phone numbers that can communicate with people. You equip them with the message, you give them the facts, and you give them the tools, and you trust your people to get the message out. It's more authentic that way. It comes from people that are trusted sources. They're able to articulate it in a context that's appropriate for the situation and for the employee. And so for larger organizations, I think that's what we're seeing. I'm not as worried about the tool that you use, whether it's text or phone calls or whatever. We know that that's what it's going to come down to. But it's, what are you authorized to communicate is one thing. And then, the hearts and minds component, how do you communicate that with empathy while towing the company line? I think that that's really what it comes down to. And that's all dependent on the ethos of the company and the leadership that's in place.
Chris, this next question I'm going to give to you. It's from Colin. He asks, how do you continue on other communications for the rest of the year without looking tone deaf as a result of COVID-19?
It's a good question. To both Clinton and Ed's point, there is no end game as of now. There's no end in sight. So we could be still rolling into this 4, 5, 6 months from now. Life is going to continue. You're going to have to compartmentalize in how you communicate, whether it's regarding COVID-19 and those kind of actions, but also your other communications tools. Whether that is planning it out in a calendar, say, hey, we're going to do X, Y, and Z only once a week or twice a week. So not to take away from the severity and the formal tone of everything. But also, you also have to think about, people need solace and an outlet from what's going on. So it's going to depend on what your business is and what your content is. But also, I think the critical point is social listening, listening to what your customers want and what your followers want. If they don't want serious, then you can start to go away from that. But if they want serious, then you have to listen to what they want. As Clint said, you can't communicate with tools that aren't there. Well, you can't give your customers what they want if they don't want it, or if you don't know what they want. So I think that's critical. We're going to all be balancing it out from here on out. Now you see brands that are trying to chime in, because brands, for whatever reason, they have the ears of a lot of consumers, and people will listen to what Wendy's and Burger King tweets over what your local law officials will tweet, which this is one interesting timeline we're living in. So I think you have to take that into consideration. What are you trying to accomplish with your communications goals in the end? Is it something you can salvage? And then how can you plan that out while keeping that serious tone, but also not being tone deaf and just completely alienating your consumer base?
Yeah, and kind of, I was going to say, on adding on to that note, I think it's important to be agile and flexible in your communication strategies. So many of us have plans that in an ideal scenario, we would respond to the crisis this way, when in actuality, there are so many real world examples that come in and just completely change the way we have to respond. And Clint, I know you were jumping in. What else did you have to add?
I was just gonna add something that we have clients, as you mentioned, Austin, that are across the board. We're incredibly diverse, geographically, industry-wise. So, I don't think that there's any universal truth out there for when is the right time. But what I can tell you, to use the judge's phrase, is that there is a huge void in the marketplace right now. There's every company that you can think of is probably choosing to be invisible as opposed to be visible at this stage because of the level of uncertainty surrounding, what's happening from a global business standpoint, what's happening with their workforce, and so on. For the companies that are ideally situated, there's going to be a first mover advantage that's going to come into play. It has to be, situationally appropriate. But I know that our friends in the media, I know that the people that are on social media that are your true influencers and followers are looking for that credible information. They're looking for those leadership aspects from our corporations and from our elected officials. So, being visible while everyone else is invisible gets you a premium on return. Now, it has to be, thoughtful. It has to be artful in how you deliver it in the context of what's happening. But I think there are opportunities for thought leadership and for, advancing your calendar of opportunities, but they're going to have to be adjusted for what's happening in the world today. I think that's what the best in class companies are going to do. Just today, I saw that Gap is starting to manufacture, masks and gowns. Allbirds is going to be giving away shoes to healthcare workers. Those are wonderful, strategies, but you're pivoting entire supply chains and manufacturing capabilities to that game. So that's a big decision. And I think that you're going to see more brands jump into the fray. And it'll be interesting to see, the long tail, how that plays out. And to Jeff's point, I think Chris's point rather, that the social listening standpoint, the feedback loops that you need to have in these situations from your employees, from your customers, from your social people that you're following, that you're engaging with online, are absolutely critical. If you want to know if you're being tone deaf, you don't have to look very far.
Yeah, it's 100% accurate. And Judge Emmett, speaking of brands and companies, I know that in your role, especially during Harvey, there was a lot of cooperation with local businesses, nonprofits, and just, kind of rallying together and having that community support. In one locally, actually, Texas Monthly reported this morning that HEB began talking with Chinese retailers in January to learn from them and begin wargaming pandemic simulations on February 2nd. So we've seen a lot of positive feedback from, the response from HEB, Kroger, other grocers. What can other companies or, even other regions kind of learn from working with the public and private sector?
Well, one of the groups that we haven't heard enough from are the nonprofits. One of the saving graces after Harvey was the effort put on by Baker Ripley to set up the center down at NRG for people who needed shelter. We need to reach out to them more. They need to be part of this process because they're the ones that are out there on the front lines, not just during crisis, but all the time. They're the ones that are dealing with the public on a regular basis. I'm going to treat this, since we're in a presidential year, we've all seen presidential debates, so I'm going to treat this like one. You ask a question, but I'm going to answer a question I wanted you to ask instead. And we went into this so divided politically, and I don't mean to offend anybody, but President Trump's not the greatest communicator in the world. I'll just leave it at that. And so he was trying to address it politically, but so were people overseas. I thought it was a joke at first when people attacked him and others for cutting off flights to China, saying, oh, that's xenophobic. In fact, the mayor of Florence, Italy, declared one day, hug a Chinese day. And they all went out and, hugged Chinese. Was that the right thing to do? No. Was what he did the right thing to do? We don't know. But if there's a good that comes out of this, I think we are beginning to break down some of those political walls a little bit. And everybody says, okay, we're in this together. Let's figure out how to get out of it. Talking about HEB in China, Jim Crane just flew in a 747 for the Texas Medical Center full of personal protection gear, came from China. That's kind of an interesting message to get out there. But the other point I want to make is that, and this goes back to an earlier question about which agencies, but I'm going to say, which media do you listen to? People in our area think that the hospitals are about to be overrun. That's not true. Houston hospitals, Houston area hospitals are 50 to 80% occupancy right now. We have space. New York's a different circumstance. So when people hear things from a national perspective and they don't necessarily apply locally, then that causes some confusion. So in communicating to your workers, and I would say this, government officials locally should communicate pure local information, not worry so much about what's going on nationally.
It's a really thoughtful response, and we've got some other questions coming in. And Judge Emmett, I'm going to give this one to you as well. It's from Patrick in South Carolina. He says, our state emergency office has asked media not to use shelter in place, but to use stay at home due to the fact that shelter in place is a phrase from Cold War, and it translates to hearing impaired incorrectly. You kind of mentioned this a little bit earlier with Judge Doggo issuing the stay home, work from home mandate here in Harris County. What are some of your other thoughts against using that term?
Well, shelter in place, I've never really equated it with a Cold War. That may be correct, but it's more you stay inside the house. You don't open any windows. You don't go outside. In this case, we're not saying that. We're telling people stay as normal as possible, but just stay at home, work from home. Clearly, you're going to have contact with your family. You're going to be able to move about the community a little bit. And I think that's what all the officials were trying to get the message out. We're not asking everybody to just lock themselves in their houses, and that's what shelter in place implies.
We've got another question. And this can be for anyone, but how do you balance a message on the seriousness of the situation, but also convey that in a calming manner? And I think we've kind of touched on this a little bit, but all right, hold on. We've got some more questions coming in. Okay, we'll just go ahead and skip that one. Let's see. This one comes from Scott. To pick up on the theme of the need for credible information, do you think this is an example of availability bias and that we've lost over this past few years something deeper, which is our ability for critical thinking? If this premise is true, how can leaders today reset the critical thinking skills of their constituents so that people begin to question sources of information through some intellectually solid approach?
I'm going to let one of the others answer the question, but I'm going to mention something that I do to my students at Rice. I ask them to watch MSNBC for 30 minutes and Fox News for 30 minutes back to back. They can watch the same subject and you think you're on two different planets. So somehow we've got to get away from people being able to choose the news they want versus get the news they need. Clint ought to be able to follow that one.
Yeah, I would think, right now there are so many opportunities to communicate. There's obviously so many channels, and the beauty as communicators, what we have today is a complete arsenal. And the media is only one component of what you have to work with. And I do think that based on, staying what Chris was saying earlier, look at the alerts you get on your phone. Look at the push mechanisms that are coming to you from, Harris County, if you're subscribed to the text message systems, emergency response alerts, customer notifications. Everything's being pushed at you at once, including the news media. That is but one channel, but people are still consuming that information at record levels and rates, and they do still assign a high authority and credibility ranking to those elements over other kinds of chatter out there. Having said that, I do think that building a communications ecosystem around your company is what we all do as communicators day in and day out. So worrying about the agendas of certain and political leanings of certain news outlets is kind of a fool's errand. We need to focus on where our customers and our stakeholders are going to be and intersect them at those places in time. And then use our social channels, our websites, our other shared properties to make sure that we're reinforcing the messages that we want to convey and doing that meaningfully, not vapid one direction communications. If you choose to engage with the media, of course, I can tell you that they're peppering us daily for information, for analytics, for data, for sources and interviews from clients. They want to hear from people because they want the context, and the clients that are stepping into the fray have something to say. they have credible information, they have a platform from which to speak, and the ones that are not have a good reason for staying in the background. They choose to communicate on the channels that they can control and mitigate risk. And so I think that it's a balancing act depending on the objective, depending on the industry and the context of what's happening, how you choose to tell your story.
We've got about 8 minutes left in this webinar, and we've got two questions that are kind of similar from Jack at KDR. And it's more focused on best practices in communicating with your employees, whether you have multiple offices, say in Texas, New York, LA, Chicago, or if you have furloughed employees. What type of best practices would you guys recommend in communicating with these people that might be spread out or might currently be furloughed?
Well, I guess I'll jump on that one. I think there's certain rules around communicating with furloughed employees, and there's a lot of compliance aspects depending on the industry that you're in. So I can't really speak to that. I don't have a JD. Perhaps Judge Emmett could illuminate that subject, but I do think that again, it comes down to your levels of management. You've got to be able to communicate with these people on their terms, in their context. And if you don't have that capability, then point them to a resource that they can leverage and use, whether that's an intranet, a website, Slack. I've seen a lot of those types of things, or all company Zooms, like we're having an all company Zoom this afternoon to update folks on what we're hearing and seeing. So, the tools are available, and the old school still works, communicating with your line managers and having them push messages out. And if the workforce is completely isolated and remote, I don't know, who doesn't have a device these days. So I think those opportunities are there. But, for like Judge Emmett, I mean, everybody's having to learn new uses of distance technology to try to find that connectedness to their organization. So how you build the ecosystem of messages and how you use those tools is completely reliant on the industry that we're discussing.
Chris, Judge Emmett, do you guys want to jump in on this?
I don't, because I'm typing an answer.
Perfect.
I've never worked at a place that has offices in multiple locations. Even though I have a PhD, I'm not sure what the law allows in terms of communication with furloughed employees. But this would just be my educated offer. If you have an office in multiple time zones, you need to have a point person in communications or a point person on your staff who's allowed to disseminate that information, and they be the point of contact or the point of communication to those places in those offices or those time zones. Because one person can't communicate to 18,000 people. You're going to have to break it up. So if your team gets the same message, whether that's from 10 different point people or whatever, you're going to have to shoulder the load as a team together.
Our next question comes from Steph. She says she works in animal welfare. She asked, are there any tips or best practices for those of us that are volunteers but who are communicating to the public? And that question, it looks like it was just answered, that are communicating to the public right now. Let's see, it just went away. Someone answered it.
All I did was say thank you to Steph, because she made a nice comment about hearing from me. I think it really does get back to trying to share accurate information. And I don't think I can stress enough right now. We need to start pivoting to the future. Start saying, okay, I'll use it again. What's the end game going to be? To say we're all in this together is one thing, but how are we going to out of this? What's the next step? And I think that's important to note. I will say that early on, the decision to close the rodeo, for example, I'm going to be a little bit critical here, that the rodeo was in a county facility, but yet the mayor of Houston announced it was closing, and he did it at a press conference surrounded by city council members. That really wasn't a city action. That should have been more of a county action. That's a live and learn thing. But I think at this point, what I want to see next all the county judges. And by the way, for those who don't know, the county judge is the director of emergency management for the entire county. That came about after 9/11, when the state legislature said there has to be one person in charge. Otherwise, you'd have all the mayors doing different things. So the county judges are the group that need to be turned to. And I'd like to see them all come together and say, here's what we're looking at going forward. This is how we're going to know that it's time to move on. We don't have that yet. And they may not. And this is a unique circumstance that we've not seen before. I'm not being as critical as it might sound, but it's just people have got to know, is this going to go on forever? And of course it's not. But how do we give them that lift that says there is going to be a path out of this sooner or later?
Got just a few minutes left. And again, I want to thank our panelists for joining us on this conversation. I hope that it's been informative for everyone that has been watching online. And if you haven't had the opportunity to watch yet, we are also going to share this on our digital platforms as well. So expect an email communication coming out tomorrow. I've heard that Facebook Live is not streaming this right now, so my apologies for that. And before we wrap up, I want to kind of go around to each one of you with this question in mind. I've seen this come in from a few different people, but if we're having this conversation at this time next year, or perhaps 5 years from now, what is our big takeaway or lesson that we have from this pandemic? Judge Emmett, we'll start with you.
Oh, we will. Again, I think this is a seminal moment in healthcare. It's a new role for government to play. Government, other than I'm old enough to go back to the polio situation in the 50s, but still that wasn't the government coming in and saying we're going to find the solution. Once the vaccine was found, then the government helped distribute it. Hurricane Andrew was a seminal moment for hurricanes. This is going to be it for healthcare, and I do think I'll say it worries me, but it's more just of an observation. If we're successful in holding this pandemic down, then it's going to be a legitimate claim for people to say, heck, the flu killed more people than this. Why did we go through all this? So then the explanation's got to be, why did we go through all this? And that's going to be an interesting message to carry too, because we're all reading about how flu kills this many, and we don't go through this kind of a lockdown. I understand why we're doing it. I think what the government officials have done is right, but the message after this is going to be more difficult.
Chris, what about you?
I agree.
Clint, we'll go with you, then Chris will close.
Okay. Yeah, I agree with the judge. You know, I don't think there's ever been a precedent here, obviously, and I think it may actually change the kind of the goalpost for what success looks like for many of these companies. And if you look at, if you zoom out and look at what's happening just in the Harris County or city of Houston, this is an existential crisis for a lot of different industries and companies. You know, retail, restaurants, people that are dependent on high levels of working capital for their operation and access to capital liquidity. This is existential. And so we're going to be dealing with high levels of unemployment. People are going to need help and support. The companies that made the right decisions and that acted the right way, we won't know what that looks like until 6 months, a year from now. So I really adhere to what the judge said. The companies that will win are going to be looking ahead. They will be leading. They won't be following. They won't be reacting. And so that doesn't just mean furloughing employees or taking actions that need to be taken to protect your enterprise. It's going to be about how do we contribute to meaningfully to the response, how responsible and caring were we to the human beings that work in our organization throughout this period. And that kind of loyalty is going to engender the support that organizations will need to sustain themselves when they make it through, and they will. And so I'd like to see some optimism in the marketplace, for one thing, from our leadership, and the fact that, yes, we're all in it together, but the destination is where I'd like to see us focused on as a country and getting through this, because there are going to be fatalities. It's going to be a horrible situation no matter what the outcome. So we've got to focus on what's really important here. And I think that that's really where we're rightly focused as a company at Pierpont, but also what we're counseling our clients to do.
Chris, what about you?
I totally agree with what Clint and the judge said. From a New Orleans standpoint, our city and our area depends a lot on tourism dollars, and to see the city suffer the way it is heartbreaking. And the fact that they think that Mardi Gras may have been the incubator that caused New Orleans to be such a large city as part of this pandemic. I think going back to communications perspective, growing up in school, I knew crisis communications was difficult. You can't just put it in a binder and put it on your shelf. I think if anything, none of us know what we're doing really. We're all learning as we go because like Clint said, there's no precedent. We've never been down this road. None of us were alive for the flu epidemic of 1918. So we don't have a playbook for that. But if anything, it's, and I saw this question about best practices and documenting everything. Document everything you do, because none of us are going to know whether it's best practices or not until a year, 2, 5 years down the road. But if anything, it's going to force us to reevaluate. Maybe we should communicate more often. Maybe that crisis plan that I wrote 7 years ago, maybe we should edit it. And it's a live living document that needs to be edited and amended every week, because you don't know when the next pandemic's going to happen, or heaven forbid when hurricane season starts. You don't know when that next category 5's coming. So I think all of these elements, this is my academic coming out of me. It's going to make for a fascinating case study in the next decade or so, because you're not going to really feel the lasting effects of what's going on for a long time to come.
Yeah, and it's crazy to me to think how much things have changed. I remember when September 11th happened, social media was not a thing. Now it is. And so I think that has really changed the way that we've had to communicate with not only our local audience, but on a national level as well. And when we are closing this out, I do want to plug all of your social medias, and just this is something that I do on our podcast usually, but I usually say thank you so much for joining us. For listeners out there that are interested in finding anything or connecting with you more in the long term, what is the best way for them to do that? So Judge Emmett, for those interested in connecting with you, what is the best way for them to follow you?
Probably send an email to, I don't do Facebook that much. I'm on there, but probably just send an email to judgeemmett@gmail.com. But I know we're running over, but 2 points that didn't get made. The timing of this crisis with the simultaneous with the drop in the price of oil has hammered our area. And I'm sure Clint, Chris, everybody's going through that. Companies are not only suffering from this pandemic, but the oil price drop in and of itself would have been a crisis for the Houston area. And the second group that we can't forget about, there are Harvey victims still haven't recovered from Harvey. And I'm afraid that now the COVID-19 is going to push that to the side, and people who never got relief from Harvey are going to be left stranded again. And that's going to be unfortunate.
Yeah, absolutely. Chris, for you, for people that want to connect with you or perhaps check out your book, what is the best way for them to do so?
They can go to my website, bychrisyandle.com. That's B-Y, not B-U-Y. Or any social media platform at Chris Yandle. Happy to chat, happy to connect.
And Clint, I know you're super active on social media. What is the best way for our audience to connect with you?
I don't know if that would qualify as super active, but yeah, you can reach me at my email address is probably the best way, cwoods@peercom.com. You can find that at our website too. But appreciate you putting this together, Austin, and your leadership with IABC for what you do for our community. And I think it's important that we have these dialogues. So thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Clint, for the kind words, and for Clint, Chris, and Judge Emmett for all joining this webinar. And for those out there, if you want to share this, it'll be available probably this evening online. We'll also send an email out tomorrow. But if you have any questions or feedback, please send them our way, IABCHouston@gmail.com. We'll be happy to get back to you. And we hope that you all stay safe. This is a very challenging time, and we all need to come together as a community. If you want to share best practices, collaborate with people. We shouldn't be looking at ourselves as competitors at this time. We're all in this together. This is a one-team effort. So just keep that in mind. And again, I'd like to thank our panelists, Judge Ed Emmett, Clint Woods, and Chris Yandle for joining us. And if you want to follow them on social media, their Twitters are at Ed Emmett, at C Woods, and at Chris Yandle. Thank you again to everyone who joined, and we hope you enjoyed it. Thank you.